Professor Alison Blay-Palmer and Ms. Amrita Battista. Professor Palmer is UNESCO Chair on Food, Biodiversity and Sustainability Studies, the founding director for the Center for Sustainable Food Systems, and a professor in Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, Canada. The research and teaching combines a passion for sustainable food systems, biodiversity, and community viability through civil society engagement and innovative governance. The next speaker is Ms. Amrita Battista. Is the Director of Programming, Education and Communication for the UNESCO Chair on Food, Biodiversity and Sustainability Studies, and the Project Coordinator for the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems at the same university. She co-produces and hosts a research podcast, I think, titled Handpicked Stories from the Field. With this introduction, I hand over the platform to the speakers. Thank you.
Hi. Am I able to do a screen share? Is that
Yes.
possible? Or Amanda, do you want to? I guess I have to do that. Okay, super. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. There we go. Thank you so much for having us. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I've really enjoyed hearing from the other speakers. Amanda and I are really excited to be here today to share and think about something with you. We have really enjoyed the opportunity to put together our work in a new way as we present to you for this conference. So what we're going to be talking about are how our stories on sustainable food systems transformation get shared out through podcasts that Amanda does. And we're going to think about, first of all, what we mean by sustainable food systems. And then we're going to talk to you about, Amanda will share all of the amazing work that she's doing on podcasting and how that acts as a community learning tool. So thank you very much for having us. So in terms of sustainable food systems, what we just sort of like to give you a quick overview as to what we mean by sustainable food systems. And then once we've done that, we'd like to link that to the SDGs in a more explicit way. And then, as I said, we'll go on to talk about how this links to community education and pedagogy, and look in particular at the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems podcast called Handpicked Stories from the Field that Amanda has developed entirely from the ground up. So I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing all about that. But first, we're going to start with a bit of a primer on what sustainable food systems are and what some of the food systems challenges are that we're facing around the world. So first of all, on the ecological side, if we think about some of the challenges that the world is facing in terms of biodiversity, there is a huge amount of biodiversity loss, and this is resulting in over $570 million in annual crop losses. So we're losing money as well as biodiversity every year because of the way that people are farming globally. In terms of the next slide, please. In terms of climate change, we know now very clearly that the global food system contributes at least 31% of greenhouse gas emissions to the climate crisis. So this is a huge contribution in terms of devastation, but it also offers a great opportunity for change. When we look at the impact of the global food system on people, we see that there's an estimated over 3 billion people who can't afford a healthy diet. And this is despite the fact that we have enough food to feed the entire world a healthy diet. We don't have the means, and people don't have the means of purchasing food that's healthy for them. They instead rely on ultra-processed food, or in the case of 820 million people, suffer from food insecurity. And then finally, if we look at what's going on in terms of livelihoods, we also know that the global food system is increasingly jeopardizing opportunities at the local scale, are disappearing. And this is particularly true for women and youth. So at the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems and through the UNESCO Chair on Food, Biodiversity, and Sustainability Studies, what we are doing is looking at ways to address these challenges and bring together these problems into opportunities so that we can integrate across the system, and we can use the resources within communities, including traditional and Indigenous knowledges, to help understand how we can do food differently. So basically, a food system that we're talking about is fair. So in this way, for example, it pays a fair wage, it's healthy, it provides accessible, healthy food that's grown in ecological conditions to communities. It's localized, so as much food is grown in the local environment as possible. It regenerates the environment, so it helps to protect biodiversity, it helps to regenerate soil and water quality. And it's also integrative, so it takes a systems approach, which is really central, as we all know, to the SDGs. And it's also inclusive in that it brings together and provides opportunities for all people in our communities. So for example, we have a project in Brazil, just to give you a sense as to how this looks on the ground, that brings together traditional erva mate farmers. So they're farming a traditional tea. They're doing it in an agroforestry context. So they're using a mixed farming with animals, very low density animals within a forest environment. They're growing some of the food for themselves and their communities, but they're selling the crop that they sell is erva mate tea. They process it locally and they distribute it through a local co-op that pays farmers a fair wage. And it also helps to support women and youth in having livelihood opportunities. So this is just one example of the kind of project that we're involved in. And another thing that the project does is it allows people to both study and understand and farm in a way that's more ecologically regenerative. So there's conservation of local varieties. They're able to remediate water quality and preserve soil, and also farm in a way that reduces soil erosion, and landscape degradation. So one of the things that we think about at the center is how all of this relates to the SDGs. So of course, zero hunger is front and center in our minds as we're thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals. But we also address other goals, including quality education and gender equality. And these are addressed through projects. For example, one of the projects that we have in Quito with one of our PhD candidates is working to understand how gender and urban agriculture intersect to provide livelihood opportunities, but also guarantees more food security for local farmers and also for local families who face high levels of food insecurity. And this helps to bolster gender equality as it provides more opportunities for women. In terms of SDGs 13, which is climate action, 14, which is life underwater, and 15, which is life on land, there are many ways through the chair and its partners that we're helping to improve soil quality, protect biodiversity, preserve and improve water quality, and sequester carbon. So since we have lost about 75% of our crop diversity from farmers' fields since the early 1900s. And because the better use of agricultural biodiversity can contribute to more nutritious diets, and it also, as I explained before, enhances livelihoods for farming communities, it can also provide more resilient and robust farming systems. In terms of 16 and the final goals, 16 and 17, peace, justice, and peace, justice, and strong institutions, as well as partnerships. By working together with communities around the world, we have partnerships in 12 countries, and we work with many different communities to build stronger and more resilient and sustainable food systems. And so one of the things that we want to do with our work is share it out so that people can understand why it's important and what kind of models we have to offer to the world. And this is where Handpicked comes in. It's just won a Laurier Achievement Award, and we're very proud of that at our university. And the approach that we take that's foundational to the podcasts is captured in this slide. So some of the questions that we ask about our research is whether or not the extent to which we can use a systems approach to document good practices and lessons learned. So that's one of the central focuses of the podcasts. They're also a possibility or an opportunity to develop new integrative educational programs. It gives us an opportunity to move increasingly towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And as I said before, it also helps to build learning networks to share this knowledge and build resilient regional food systems. So with that context in mind, I'm going to hand it over now to Amanda so she can tell you all about the really exciting work that she's doing with the Handpicked podcast.
Thanks, Alison. And I'm sorry, I had a slide malfunction there for a moment, so I'm sorry about that. As Alison said, we're really, as she outlined some of the research that we're doing at the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems and through the UNESCO Chair on food biodiversity and sustainability studies, I think you can hear some of the how proud we are of that research and how much that research is embedded in community partnerships. One of the things that we find, though, is that like all institutions, there are all sorts of barriers to sharing that research more broadly with the general public. So one of the strategies, I mean, we have quite a robust knowledge mobilization strategy where we are working with the university to promote that research and get our research findings out into the public so that we can affect real change. But one of the strategies that we're using that seems to have sort of a little bit of a life of its own and seems to really resonate with our communities, our students, and our researchers more broadly. Is the podcast, is Handpicked Stories from the Field. So that is really exciting for us. But I just wanted to sort of outline some of the major challenges we see so that we can think a little bit about how podcasting as an educational technology speaks directly to these barriers. One, of course, is a difference in language, different languages, obviously, but what we're finding is that researchers really speak in nuanced and complex ways as they need to really get at the complex concepts that they are researching, but that doesn't always resonate with the broader public. So there is a bit of a translation that needs to happen between academic language or research language and language that is easily accessible more broadly. Relatedly, there's really a difficulty distilling complex research findings for a general audience and for our students. We often have difficulty reaching new audiences, partly because there are researchers often behind a paywall, and that's something that we are really working to move beyond at the Center for Sustainable Food Systems, but also because there's a lack of media attention to some of the more community-based work that's going on. As we all know, news cycles are fast and they are fickle. So really prioritizing some of the incredible change-making work that's happening through research can be really difficult. So at Handpicked Stories from the Field, our goal is to put researchers and researchers and community partners in conversation with each other and to invite our listeners in. So in each episode, we work with researchers and community partners to translate their research about sustainable food systems into stories that anyone can listen to and understand. Our goal is to bring the voices of those working in the field directly to the listener and to provide a little bit of narration along the way to fill gaps or guide the story or explain complex concepts. So the podcast is really a tool for overcoming some of those barriers that I just pointed to. Specifically in regards to language, we engage in that conversation with community researchers and community partners in very plain language. We ask questions that ground their experience, their research and everyday experience to help give listeners an entry point that they wouldn't necessarily have through a research paper or in a conference presentation. We give opportunity to really distill those complex findings into passionate stories, which really gives the content a new life and creates connection with a broad range of listeners. We also reach new audiences through the very organic way that podcasts are moved through online spaces, and that podcast listeners encounter new material. We also use social media in a way to broaden those networks and reach new people. Because our podcasts are free, we can overcome that barrier of paywalls pretty easily. And we are very lucky to have funding through the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food System to do this work. So we really feel like it's very important to make sure that all of our episodes are publicly accessible, open access, and licensed under the Creative Commons, so folks can use them in their classes or adapt them for their needs, and available on all the major podcasting platforms. And we also tend to get a little bit of media attention because this is a really digestible format that lends itself very well to community radio, for example. So we have been featured on community radio here in Waterloo in Canada, and we have also been interviewed by the CBC, which is our national public broadcaster. Handpicked is, for me, a joy to work on, partly because it is such a collaborative project where students and researchers and community partners come together and work with my co-producer and I, Lane Young, to create something special to go out into the world. One of those guest producers is Andrew Spring, the Associate Director of the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems. And he's worked with us on 3 episodes now that showcase the perspectives of his research partners in Indigenous communities in the Northwest Territories in Canada. I would like to share a short video that we recently, that our university recently produced, because I think it is, it's really lovely to hear Andrew's voice and the voice of his community partner, Chief Lloyd Chico. So if you'll permit me, I will just share this really quickly.
Ma'am, there is no audio, ma'am.
Is there no sound? Oh. Give me one quick sec. I will restart. I think I have to change my settings. Apologies. Let me give it one more shot, and if it doesn't work, I'll just tell you what he said. Technology is great until it's not, right? Okay. Alison, can you let me know?
Us adapting to the changes, we're not just going to sit back. It's affecting the way we hunt. I think it's getting warmer too fast.
I'm Amrita Battista. I am the project coordinator for the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems. I am also the co-producer of Handpicked, Stories from the Field, and I co-produce the research podcast with Lane Young.
And I'm Andrew Spring. I'm a research associate here at Laurier. I'm also the associate director of the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems. And I got the opportunity to work with Amanda and Lane to put together a podcast with our partners up in the Kagitu First Nations in Kekisa, Northwest Territories.
The approach that we've taken with Handpicked is really a conversation, and that is really intentional. For the work that's happening at the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems, a lot of that happens on the ground with community partners. When you sit community partners and researchers down together, they tell you wonderful and interesting stories, and their research really comes alive.
The podcast and that kind of method really gives us the opportunity to go a bit more in depth as to, a bit more about the connections and the relationships behind the research. You don't get those in these other kind of publications. So our experience with Chief Lloyd Chico and Melaine Simba in Kekisa, it really reflected more of the connection and the friendship that kind of has happened as part of the research. we've created this really amazing system where we learn from each other, and I think it's a really good example of how research should be done in the North. The work started really in 2014 when we were asked by the community to help them with a climate change adaptation plan. And so what grew out of that was really, I guess, 4 themes. And one was learning how to grow food. The other one was waste management. We've been setting up recycling and composting programs in the community ever since. It was about intergenerational knowledge exchange, so getting youth and elders together on the land. And it was about research and monitoring and giving the community better capacity to be stewards of their own land. We're learning a lot because we have such a great relationship, and we're able to do lots of kind of thinking outside of the box and just try new things. And I think it's really important that we look for other ways to share that research and share those outcomes with other communities, be they in the Northwest Territories or in other places around the world that are kind of seeing some of these impacts of climate change and are looking for new innovative ways to kind of adapt the community or adapt their food systems.
If we can go into a community that we're already working with and have long-standing trust-based relationships with and gather footage and then create a podcast out of that then our community partners also listen to and help us tweak and those sorts of things, then that's really important to us, right? We have the opportunity to create something that we can use to get the research out into the world, but also that is valuable to the community because they get to hear their own voices and that they can also use these things as tools for communicating with policymakers and decision makers and for telling their own stories.
I see us adapting to.
No need to watch that again. So thank you for letting me share that, because I think that one of the things that I always miss in a presentation like this is that you don't get to hear my voice and how excited I am to share information about the podcast and my experience using it as a tool for research communication and for public education, but you don't get to hear why the researchers and community partners are interested in it. So thank you for letting me share that. So the goals of Handpicked are really, I've talked about these a little bit already, but they really are to share knowledge among researchers, community members, and students, to tell meaningful and interesting research stories, and to help the audience understand the content and how to use that new knowledge, how to use research and how it applies to their everyday lives. There are a few main components of a good research podcast, or a good podcast in general, but I think especially important for a good research podcast is that, this list is obviously not exhaustive, but this is one of the things that we talk to our researchers about before we sit down and start a conversation. So we always want to make sure that our content is told, the conversations are in a personal voice. So mistakes are okay, jokes are okay. It's okay to be a little bit casual. The content of that those podcasts is going to be really robust. So showing, letting passion come through and linking to everyday current events and context through personal experience is really important. Obviously, we use narration as a way to make links to current events and ground things in context, so that if that doesn't come through in the conversations that we have, but it's really very easy for us to allow space for passion to come through. That's not something that we actually have to work very hard at all. I'm sure that you've all had the experience of asking somebody, a researcher, about their work and having them tell you all sorts of really interesting things really quickly. So we have no trouble getting content. But it is really special when you hear a researcher or community partner say, this is my passion project, or this research has made this impact in my community, and this is why it's important to me. For instance, you heard Chief Lloyd Chico in that video. In that episode of Handpicked, he told us that he described the reciprocal relationship between the people of the Kakitu First Nation in Kakisa and the student researchers that often go into the community and live with the community and work there. For Chief Chico, having those students in the community is an opportunity not only to conduct critical community-led research on the impacts of climate change on the fragile northern ecosystem, but it's also an opportunity to educate those student researchers about traditional knowledge and food systems so that they take that knowledge back to the university and impact the way that research is conducted. So that's one of the real privileges of working on this project, is the opportunity to hear that part of the research relationship. Obviously, we've talked about relatable content, but good quality sound and good technical production is also quite important, because while you may have a very generous listener, if your audio is terrible, it's very difficult on them to hear it all the way through. So we try to create podcasts with the listener in mind. As Alison said before, we're really excited to present today because we have had this opportunity to really think about the podcasting practice as an educational practice, and to articulate that a little bit more explicitly. Handpicked really started as a knowledge mobilization tool, as a way to share out our research with the public audience, but we are finding that it is increasingly becoming an important part of our educational programming across the UNESCO Chair and across our research center. This program really involves three distinct kinds of education: formal education, where students are in post-secondary classrooms, and Alison and Andrew are teaching in that context. But we've also heard from educators that use Handpicked as a teaching tool regularly in their classrooms. In fact, Alison's using 3 episodes this term in her classes. The other kind of education that we engage in regularly is community education. And I think this is an interesting way to think about. I think that this connects really interestingly to Jennifer's presentation earlier, where we're thinking about research and education together in this case, right? We do a lot of community-based research, but in that context, there's also education taking place. And then public education. Each of our podcasts is highly educational and reaches broad audiences, so that's pretty neat. We also provide technical and training support for researchers and students and community partners. We're building capacity in our communities for episode production, for thinking through those research relationships and the impacts of that work. And we are developing free and open access teaching tools that go along with each episode. So at the same time, we're sort of creating this really iterative and interesting episode archive, where we have the ability through the podcast to be self-referential. So we can say, in episodes 2 of our last season, we talked about this. And so this topic relates to something that we talked about a few episodes ago. Or as in the case with Andrew's work, we have the opportunity to update that work as more findings come out in a really lovely way that listeners can encounter on their own time and in their own way. We're also starting to participate in broader podcasting networks and online communities, which is really exciting. So that means that at our university, for instance, we offer training and consultation really to other folks who are interested in podcasting. And the podcast is really exciting, which is really exciting for me, is the podcast is becoming part of our research programs more intentionally. And we can see that, and I'll come back to that in just 1 minute, but I think that is really an exciting evolution of that work. Just really quickly, as we try to support podcasts as a educational tool, we also have some other things that need to, my time is up, isn't it? I will wrap it up. All right, we also have educational resources that go along with our podcast, including show notes, transcriptions, discussion questions, infographics, and other things. And perhaps I will put a link in the bio or in the chat in a moment so that you can check out our new research that will incorporate podcasting as method, education, and knowledge mobilization tool. And this is called Voicing Change, but I'll put in the chat so that you can learn more about it. So thank you very much. I apologize for going over time.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot for your interesting talk on sustainable food systems and linking with SDGs. Really useful and interesting podcast as well. So there is a question here from the participant. So So they're curious about how visual impacts of presentation can be just projected in on the audio alone in podcasts.
Sorry, Amanda, do you want to take the first question?
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally understand it, but I'll take a stab. I think so. There's something really interesting about. I know that visuals can be really helpful, but there's something really interesting about allowing space for folks to just listen. There's a lot of research in sort of ethnomusicology and about soundscapes and how important those are for different kinds of learning. But podcasts have this beautiful sort of focus to them. And we find that people are also taking them with them in different ways. So if you were watching a video, you can't listen to that in your car. You can't watch that in your car as you're commuting or on the bus a little bit. So we're finding that the simplicity of the audio and the size of the audio is the downloadability and the flexibility allows it to sort of be in people's lives in really different ways, and it lets them travel with them in different ways. So we find that it's fantastic. It's really a great way for sharing research.
Thank you. Next question is, did you have experience in engaging bloggers and vloggers or journalists into knowledge dissemination?
I can take a stab. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Amanda.
would you? No, please go ahead.
Okay, and I'm sure something will occur to you as I'm talking. Yeah, we have a very, thanks to Amanda, we have a very an excellent knowledge mobilization and communications plan, and we bring together all of these different components through that communication strategy. I think what I've noticed, sort of being a little bit on the outside of Amanda's great work, is that the podcasts help to spur other kinds of engagement. So a podcast can be linked to a blog, or a blog can be the impetus for a podcast. And there's a lot of iteration between the work that happens on the knowledge mobilization side. But I'm not the expert in that area, in this area. Amanda is. I do research and networking and stuff, and Amanda does the podcasting. So I'm sure she has other insights to share.
Yeah. So there's another question. Where can we listen to your podcast? I think there is a link you already shared, right?
I did. I just popped the link to our podcast into the chat. I'll also pop the link to Voicing Change, our new research project that will be really incorporating podcasts quite intentionally. So if you're interested in how that will take shape, we'll be posting information there. We also, we struggle to, not that we struggle to engage with journalists. I think that, as I said before, journalists are, the news cycle is really quick. But because we have a podcast that is so easily digestible for the general public, we have had journalists reach out to us, and we do share the podcast really easily. So I think that that's one of the beauties of it. It's very easy to translate to radio context, or to do an interview about, because you have a soundbite that's ready to go all the time. So it's really enabled some more public engagement for us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your interesting presentation.